Maayong buntag, Pilipinas. Good morning, Philippines. 3 years ago, in May 23, Marawi City in southern Mindanao was under siege. The protracted feud between the armed forces of the Philippines and the militant Maote rebels sponsored by the ISIS group set worldwide headlines, which may be construed as a hybrid warfare. To help us in this discussion, I have with me Mr. Georgi Engelbrecht, peacebuilding and humanitarian specialist and senior analyst of the International Crisis Group. We welcome to our Zoom conversation. I know that this topic is quite heavy, but I believe with your judgment and about the situation in Mindanao. Good morning, Georgie.
Hey, mayong buntag, Chester. Kumusta?
Buti naman. Thanks for having us here in our podcast interview. Anyway, let me begin with my questions.
Sure.
We try to level off first with these heavy concepts that we're deliberating here in our conversation so that our listeners may understand what we're talking about. From the lenses of your expertise as peace building and humanitarian specialist, and now the senior analyst of the International Crisis Group, working to prevent wars and shape policies that will build a more peaceful world. How do you define hybrid warfare and violent extremism? And can you also share with us some of your experiences in the field, particularly in Mindanao, in dealing with this topic?
Okay, sure. Thanks for that question, Chester. Well, first of all, I think in my perspective, we have to be a little bit careful with both concepts, especially in the Mindanao context. One refers specifically to actors and their behavior, the violent extremist angle. The other one is about a concept of war, or let's say a strategy, something which has come up in the recent years. Talking about violent extremism, I think I would prefer probably to use also other terms when talking about some of these armed groups, like militants, for instance. I recall a very interesting conversation in Cotabato City when one civil society leader told me right now that, okay, so we have a lot of donor agencies, we have a lot of interest in preventing violent extremism, but the problem is, what does it actually mean? Because ultimately it could also be, a quite ambiguous catchphrase encompassing sometimes everything, and then again, nothing. It is of course much better than a very divisive or like a politically charged term like terrorists. I think we still need to go deeper into what we actually mean. Like you mentioned the Maute, and when we look at them and when we analyze them, it's basically an armed group using violent tactics. So when we talk about extremity, extreme in what way? Extreme in their faith, extreme in their commitment to fight. Neither will explain to us about the total set of motivations of members of these groups, because as we know, and I think research has shown it, some of them were youngsters pretty much recruited to fight for money. Others have joined opportunistically, just like in other civil wars around the globe, young, angry man with a lot of grievances shooting the gun in the air, and for others it's just another chapter of the struggle against the oppressor. And I think when you go to the communities actually and you ask them about all these non-state armed groups, when you inquire about the Abu Sayyaf, the BFF, they will tell you it's an armed group. It's maybe jokingly, it's the freedom, talking about the Bangsamoro Islamic freedom fighters, or it's the local ISIS. But hardly anyone would probably use that term. And I think when you also look at what happened before Marawi and after, the ambushes of soldiers in Lanao del Sur, in Maguindanao, in Sulu, shootings of policemen, attacks on checkpoints using IEDs. It's just the same playbook as Mao Zedong, and maybe in a way like other insurgencies in the 21st century around the globe. So I think with violent extremism, it's always a very interesting concept, but to Mindanao, we gotta be a bit, I think, probably look a bit deeper into that. And it's also great that you pointed out the concept of hybrid warfare, because I think originally the term emerged as such in the context of a conflict between a non-state group and a state. if I'm not mistaken, during the 2006 Hezbollah war with Israel. And it basically referred to a non-state armed group using a diverse array of tactics to fight a much more advanced force. These days, it is probably also used for, Russia's interventions in the Ukraine. And the elements here are irregularity, like, the irregular standing of the insurgents in connection with the conventional warfare. But again, to Mindanao, and probably also have thoughts on this. I think in Mindanao, the rebels have always been operating rather traditionally. Like what I said before, the ambush tactics, setting of bombs, it's nothing we haven't seen elsewhere. It's just that Marawi probably really impacted, a lot of analysis and observations on that topic. And perhaps Marawi is the only example where you could use that term because for one, we have seen information outreach and information warfare, if you want, on the internet before the siege, during the siege, in terms of, people using Facebook, Telegram, WhatsApp, even the BFF, they had a website at some point, which was very interesting because it has shown that there's a battle of perceptions, especially during the siege. And I think ISIS or the Mounties, they were communicating that we're not the ones destroying the city. It's basically Duterte's army. It's the military who basically smashed Ground Zero. And in contrast to the BIF and the other armed groups, the Mounties really, together with their allies from Basilan, they managed to hold territory. And I think it was the game changer which made a lot of people think that is something fundamentally different. But if you think about it again, what did they actually hold? I mean, it's not like they occupied the area and life continued. It was more or less a perpetual state of conflict. And I think in that sense, again, hybrid warfare can probably also shed some light on it. I think, even when you think about criminal means as a support to an armed group, which is one of the characteristics of the concept, I believe, we had this even before, not only with the Mounties, but with the other armed groups who have to sustain themselves somehow. Even right now, the ASG or some factions of the ASG is involved in kidnapping in Sulu, and they get funds through that activity. But I do not see necessarily a correlation to jihadist activities per se, that you can say ISIS in Sulu now is using kidnappings to have the specific agenda. So in that sense, I would still go back a little and say if traditional patterns, something we already knew, it's just the outlier of Marawi. It's something really unique in that sense.
Wow, those are interesting insights coming from you. And meaning to say, although they use traditional tactics, but it's a little bit hybrid because they use some technologies also. And I heard that they use even drones and other sophisticated technology during the warfare in Marawi. But the Philippines recently commemorated its third anniversary of the Marawi siege in Mindanao, while the world is in battle with the contagious coronavirus pandemic, which is a form of a human-induced disaster. Let me quote the Vice President of the Philippines when she said that Marawi continues to suffer even as we all face the challenges brought about by the COVID-19. And the ongoing crisis should have by now made us realize that the suffering of one redounds to the suffering of all. You've been to the ground zero in Marawi several times, I presume, but how do you assess the trauma of the Marawi people and generally the Filipinos who experience this so-called civil war? I call it civil war after, of course, the AFP liberated Marawi from the 5-month clash between the government troops and the militant groups or local militants who allied with the, although you said not so much with the ISIS.
Yeah. Well, I think, it's interesting that you mentioned these two words, civil war and trauma. I mean, can we really say it's a civil war per se? It's interesting. We can talk about it. I mean, personally, I'm not so sure about that, but I do agree in the sense that the conflict was about two competing worldviews. You have, of course, the integrity of the national state, the sovereignty of the Philippines, challenged by a non-state actor fighting for something very different. And I actually doubt that 3 years after we actually know what they wanted, if they wanted to control Marawi city as such, if they wanted to, you know, expand from somewhere, if the Malta-ASG alliance had even other objectives.
Right, right.
The key here is that you mentioned trauma. It really hits the nail well, because having been in Mindanao for a few years, you really see that, you know, the capacities of the government or even non-government organizations to respond to trauma across Bangsamoro and among the conflict-affected population, it is really something which still can be strengthened, because conflict has been pervasive for decades. And if we zoom in on Marawi, just look at the facts, what we have, and I think the picture is pretty bleak. We have a continuous displacement of 70,000 people, at least, according to some statistics.
Yes.
We have pretty much uncertainty of land rights. No one really knows what is preventing the Maranaos from coming back to their home. The military camp plan of Duterte was, and the military was abandoned accordingly, but you will never know about that. And I remember when the idea came out the first time, so many Maranao leaders were utterly confused. Like, what is the purpose of that? Is it like a sign of the superiority of the, you know, the Philippine government, a reminder to the population, etc. And the COVID pandemic doesn't make it easier. I mean, for now, I think Bangsamoro as such is not so much affected as compared to other parts of the world and even within the Philippines. But I think in Lanao del Sur, we have also 9 cases that were confirmed, 14 investigation. And just imagine if it would spread, what kind of pressure it would already have on the situation, because I think in the first weeks of the pandemic, humanitarian services were already cut a little bit. People could not access Lanao and Marawi that easy anymore. Luckily, the tide has turned. Now it's getting back to normal, I believe. Ultimately, it's still a big challenge. And coming back again to trauma, this is really the issue here. The mental health of the people who were affected, and also the underreporting maybe on these issues, considering that we perceive Marawi mostly from the screens, from third-party sources. And when we get there, then we really see the impact that experience had on everyone. And I think it's also very, you know, it's not a coincidence, but do you remember the incident a few weeks ago in Cabalza with the guy being shot by the police accordingly? And one report was saying he was actually a former army member and a veteran of the siege. So think about, this is just one person, and he served the government. And you know, there's statistics probably that armed forces across the globe in a conflict might be a percentage will be affected by PTSD or something like that. Now, zoom in the whole population, how much it has affected, you know, hundreds of thousands of people living in Marawi city and environment. And until now, the majority of them from the main center of the town, they still cannot return. And personally, I admire the resilience of Filipinos in general, and also the Maranaos, of course, but also a very sad state of affairs. And I think what you also pointed out vis-a-vis the civil war, I think until now we also have different perceptions on what happened. For some, it's the liberation. For others, it's probably the destruction of the town. And maybe those people do not even blame anyone directly, but for them, Marawi, as it was, has gone. And I think what is also noteworthy here is that there's no public report on what has happened in terms of, you know, a very holistic perspective. I think only Amnesty International assessed at least the armed conflict, legally speaking, and we have countless terrorism studies, strategic studies talking about the siege, military performance. We have assessment of the humanitarian response, but as a whole, Marawi, with its deep impact on the social cultural situation of the Maranaos, it's still something which should remain in the public eye. And I'm happy that there are Congress hearings and people advocate for, you know, more, but I think considering COVID is taking over the attention of the national government, there's still a long way to go. And another issue which we obviously still have is recruitment. Mostly these recruitments are anecdotic, but nevertheless, I mean, if the city will not be rebuilt or if people not go back, I think it's just common sense that some guys will remain or will grow even more frustrated.
Yeah, I could feel the anxiety of the people of Marawi, even Filipinos, given that we are in this double whammy of pandemic, and of course with the problem or issues with the violent extremism in Mindanao. But we see terrorism and violent extremism as twin threats to national security and public safety. I know you're maybe that part of believing peace and reintegration processes in a diverse and plural society in Mindanao and southern Philippines. But the Philippine government, which officially welcomed the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, and I'm quite sure you're doing a lot of studies and cooperation there. What medium to long-term advice can you give to encourage intelligent action for peace, to various actors and players in the region to maintain peace and order, prosperity, and economy in Mindanao?
Okay, well, of course, the attention right now in the Bangsamoro is on the BARM. It's something new. It is the new promise of an entity that is not anymore a failed experiment. That's the term the government and the MILF were using for the ARMM, but rather, a new hope, so to speak. And I think, the priorities are seemingly endless. I mean, you're a new government, you're a former rebel, and then you're tasked to govern. But I think if you summarize it, there are a few things I think the BARM can do, and of course, with the support of the national government. The first thing is, of course, I believe, essentially service delivery. After all, that's the core task of a government, and after decades of conflict and underdevelopment, this is now the chance. Social services, health, education, these priorities were already outlined months before the BARM kicked off by Al-Haj Murad Ibrahim, the leader of MILF and the interim chief minister. So the attention to these issues is there. The start maybe of the BARM initially was a bit slow, but now the pandemic has also given a chance to really rise up and show the people that BARM performs more, BARM performs better, and BARM wants to make a change. Like within, I think, 40 days, a hospital was created, a testing center for COVID in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region, accredited by the national government. And I think it showed that, okay, we have to take care of our destiny. And that's a very important thing. And apart from delivering services, what the people need, it's also about building the backbone for the BARM. Because obviously, it's not only about, maybe conducting all these activities and delivering the standard services also which the local governments are doing, but it is fulfill the structure of the autonomous region, meaning to say a local government code, an administrative, an education code. Without that, there will always be critics who will question BARM. So what have you done at the end of the day? This is really important, and the time of the transition is not that long. It's just 3 years. Now we have just less than 2 years that are left. So the BARM is also coming under a lot of pressure. And one thing they also have to think about is to be also smart politicians by realizing that you are at the steering wheel of this car, of this lorry, let's say, but you're not the only passenger. You have many other interests that play a role in Muslim Mindanao, in the Bangsamoro. And ultimately, you need to make them your allies, to put forward a vision of a win-win. For instance, the Sulu archipelago, there are also many challenges there in terms of peace and order, even now with COVID, with Zamboanga city being a major point of outbreak, and Zamboanga being the economic lifeline to Sulu, Basilan, and Tawi-Tawi. So we know that the Tausug people on the islands, they're not in their majority followers of the MILF. In the past, they have been critical of the autonomous region. So the question is, how can BARM bring them on board? And how can BARM also make sure that, you know, essentially in 2022, when the elections will come, that they will try to send messages to all constituencies of the Bangsamoro. And the last thing I believe, sorry, also where the national government should play a huge role is to achieve a clarity on the security situation in the Bangsamoro, because as you probably can imagine, just go anywhere in a village, in a barangay, and you ask people who takes care of your security. And I bet, depending where you are, what province, what particular, you know, context, you will get different answers. Because until now, there's very much a plethora of security agents, of security actors in the Bangsamoro, I believe. We have, you know, the police, the army, the MILF, new institutions that were set up with the peace agreement. And I think the peace agreement 2014 lays a very good way forward for how things should go. The MILF will disarm, the AFP will redeploy, less and less militarization, but we're still maybe, you know, on the way there. We're really not coming that closer. Not to mention that guns are still proliferating. So I think it's less about coming up with new things, but strengthening what is already there. Because essentially the biggest challenges are, until now, if you see the situation, it's feuding families, it's the low-level conflict. Exactly. It's the low-level conflict between government and militant groups like the BFF, like the ASG, and you know, there needs to be a framework which can capture all of that coming from the top, I believe from the BARM, but also from the community level. And if that is fulfilled, then maybe, you know, we can have a new normal, which is less abnormal than it has been before.
Wow, that's a very nice analysis, Bert. We see Marawi still as a special case here, where of course we discuss about the civil war, urban warfare, the use of traditional and non-traditional tactics and the strategies for. Now we see we see some indicators of hybrid warfare based from your definition earlier on, and the complexity of the global extremism in time of the pandemic. But I see terrorists and violent extremists are taking this opportune time when governments are focused on the biggest global health crisis. How do you see the future landscape of a secure world in spite of the rapid development of belligerent and armed groups advocating for their respective causes? Do you think coronavirus can be used as a form of bioterrorism in the future?
Yeah, that's also a very, very interesting point. Let me just start with an anecdote here. I remember a couple of years back, there was a particular mayor somewhere down there in Mindanao who was, you know, a very famous person because of allegations that he's involved in the drug trade. And that was the height of the president's campaign against illegal drugs, right? She was termed as someone who has connections to both armed groups and government entities. And, you know, one time in the community or somewhere, people were just joking about him. And then someone just told me, you know, that guy has been poisoned and now he's gone. And I was, so, you know, I was very surprised because usually when you think about insurgent groups and whatever is happening in the Bangsamoro, you don't think that somebody might have got poisoned or something like that. It's a very unusual, you know, way of doing things. And I think it's not really a bioterror attack, but it left, you know, some puzzlement in me, meaning my perception mattered a lot. I was confused. I wasn't sure. I was maybe a little bit shocked that that happened, and I was wondering what's going on. And then you have the unusual form of that, you know, way of dealing with someone, which has also something in common with, you know, irregular warfare as such. It is a surprise to us, maybe, in some ways. It is not something that is very traditional. So when I first read this question, I thought about that example, but then I realized it's the only one. Because after all, in Mindanao, I mean, we probably have not come across something like that at all. And I think speaking about, you know, bioterrorism, for instance, in history, we only have a few examples where, it really became, evident. Like we had the Japanese cult Aum Shinrikyo that experimented with bacteria, but ultimately they were very known for the sarin attack, meaning using chemical weapons. The anthrax letters in the United States after 9/11. And if you look at science,
anthrax also.
Exactly. If you look at science fiction literature or these terrorism novels, it's always like the worst case scenario. But I also found a very interesting quote in a study by the Rand Corporations, 1975. They were talking about terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead, stressing kind of this public impact that act of violence might have. Perhaps, the times they're changing, and we never know what goes in the mind of leaders of these groups. At least, we also have to think maybe about the other side, not only state-armed groups, but also the other adversary in that conflict, which is essentially governments. Of course.
Just be holistic.
Exactly. Yeah, like 165 countries across the globe, or even more, joined the biological weapons. But we don't know to what extent some governments have such capabilities. And again, when I was reading James Darien, a very interesting also scholar of international relations, he made this interesting point talking about the global war on terror. Terrorism has emerged as the most virulent expression, meaning comparing it to a virus of sorts, which in turn triggers an antibody reaction, anti-terrorism, that in some cases could be even more devastating than the original infection. So if you want to take this metaphor, it's like a cytokine storm coming out from the response. And I think when we look at civil wars or conflicts around the globe, in some cases, we also had this, like a very excessive counterinsurgency campaign. And I think when we look at these possibilities, there are always these two sides of the coin. Because as much as the weak militants could have wanted, such an attack, God forbid if it happens, the other question is, what is also the reaction of the securitized state? Because even now, I think, during the pandemic, I think many analysis points towards governments taking care of their ultimate responsibility to provide security, sometimes at the expense of civil liberties, for instance. We can look at it, from both directions too.
Yeah. And then just to give you, or maybe share you something, there are some lobby groups here in the Philippines where they would want to amend the UN Security Act of 2007, the anti-terror law of the Philippines, into a very comprehensive law. That means that they will include issues on the PCVE, preventing, countering violent extremism and terrorism, and also, we mentioned about the CDR and the chemical, biological, and radiological and nuclear. This must be embedded in that law, and it must be also comparative in terms of the experiences of other countries when we amend this law. But lastly, for my question, COVID-19 certainly flattened the curve between the states and non-state actors, the governments, and terrorists and extremists, since all of us have a common enemy, which is the dead coronavirus. Do you think it is still a business as usual for many belligerent groups, even if the world is trying to survive from the global health threat? What other threats do you see on hybrid warfare and violent extremism in the post-COVID era?
Well, if we look first at Mindanao or the Philippines, I think when the pandemic started, even here, people were thinking, okay, now this is the chance of ISIS, or now this is the chance of terrorists to conduct even more attacks. But now, more than 2 months in the situation, what do we see on the ground? I do not see that we have a substantial change. It is as usual, at least for these, and thank you for using the term, belligerent groups, because the belligerency, the combat, or from the perspective of the insurgents, their war of liberation or their war against oppression still continues. Like the biggest incidents which we had was the ambush in Sulu on the military by the Abu Sayyaf in Patikul. We have also, never-ending low-intensity conflict in parts of Maguindanao, where the BIFF, the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, attacks military detachments. The military responds with mortars, civilians get displaced. So it's the same pattern all over. And we did not have a prominent, let's say, IED or bomb targeting civilians or something like that, neither in Mindanao nor in Manila. This is not to say it is impossible to happen, but I think in Mindanao, it's kind of, the patterns of conflict are always rooted in this particular local conditions. And I think they will continue until they're addressed to a certain degree. Globally or regionally speaking, we have, of course, a big dose of unpredictability. I mean, we heard about the Boko Haram taking advantage of food insecurity in Nigeria and other areas, trying to recruit people and also making itself very, very visible, very present. In Mozambique too, we have an upsurge of Islamist groups attacking government security forces. The question is, does the virus change things, or does the virus speed the development of things up in whatever way, on whatever level we're looking at this? One thing I have noticed is, for instance, that, since 9/11, but even before, we talked about the post-Westphalian time. We talked about the state being challenged by social, economic, technical, military developments. And now the pandemic brings back the state to the centerpiece of response. State as the main actor in this current situation. There are no more flights. We are on their own. We have to conduct our activities and shape our policies in the way that our citizens are protected. That is, the mentality or the mindset probably of many governments looking inward. But at the same time, I believe now this is the chance maybe for, and I would like to bring back again the hybrid warfare aspect again.
Right.
Maybe we can think about hybrid warfare also as a continuation of politics through other means. In that sense, it really refers to information. It refers to politics, not necessarily violence. Again, when I was reading up a bit on the topic, and I read an essay by Friedman and Pierce on hybrid war, and there was the sentence which struck me: the manipulation of information successfully executed by an adversary is a virus. So it's again a virus metaphor, but it talks about manipulating information.
In other words, it's the political virus.
I mean, that is a very interesting, maybe extreme term, of course, but of course, this is what it is. Fake news, deep fake discussion, political discussions which are getting amplified, on social media. Of course, it happened before, but I think it's even exacerbated by what is happening. And there is an example even in Barm when you have controversies between Cotabato City and the autonomous regions about protocols when it comes to COVID response. And when you look at this, facts are challenged by emotions. Emotions are generated for political objectives. Political objectives continue the conflict through another way. So I think even if we will not see that terrorists will come up as terrorists 2.0 after all of this, we have a discourse which is probably going into very, critical and dangerous directions, and we should be very much aware of it. Just the fact that it's peaceful, that then there's no big scale attacks, the structure or what is below the tip of the iceberg is peaceful warfare, I believe. And that is very much, I think, crucial for the post-COVID era.
That is a sharp analysis, Georgi. Thank you very much. Vielen Dank, Georgi.
Salamat. Yeah, danke.
Yeah, it has been a pleasure talking with you. Maraming salamat.
Likewise po, walang anuman.
Okay.